Harrigian. He's currently the director. He's currently the director of the Air Force's F-35 Integration Office, but soon to be commander of all coalition air forces in the Middle East. And I think all of us are looking forward to you assuming that command. We also have with us Colonel Max Marosko III, who is the deputy director for air and cyberspace operations at headquarters Pacific Air Forces. As you could already figured out by now, Max is going to be addressing us by a video link from Pacific Air Forces headquarters in Hawaii, where it's around 7 a.m. So thanks for getting up early for this, Max. We appreciate that. Now, both of our speakers are experienced F-15 and F-22 pilots, so they know the differences between fourth generation and fifth generation aircraft. And I've had the good fortune to command and fly with both of them, so I can at least personally attest to their flying skills in the F-22 and F-15. I can only imagine what it's like in the F-22. And most of you have heard me talk about how fifth generation aircraft bring a new dimension to joint warfighting. The ability to perform functions well beyond those of a traditional fighter. The ability to act as sensor shooters and as the basis for what in the future will become an ISR, strike, maneuver, sustainment complex that ultimately I think that we'll look at as forming a combat cloud. Now, what General Harrigian and Colonel Marosko are going to talk about are outlining a concept of operations, because realizing the potential of these aircraft isn't just resident in the technology. It's how they're used amongst each other and how they're integrated with the rest of the force. So they're here to describe, and what they have written, and I believe everyone has a copy in their paper, is a concept of employment. So with that, Cobra, over to you.
Thanks, sir. I appreciate it. Okay. I think the only caveat I'd like to add to General Deptula's introduction is that, so he goes by Freak, I go by Cobra. So that's what I'm going to live with the rest of the hour here, so we'll stick with that. But Freak and I were together as the initial cadre of Raptor guys down on the 43rd at Tyndall. So we had the opportunity to transition from the Eagle and try to wrap our minds around this fifth gen. And over the course of, really that started back in 2003, so it's been the last 13 years we've had an opportunity to watch not only the Raptor mature, but I've had the unique opportunity to understand how the F-35 fits into this larger concept of employment. I think it's also important to highlight that while Freak and I were kind of the brainchilds of this, there's a couple other guys out there that were key contributors. Moto Nimai, now the third wing commander. He was a Raptor guy and an F-35 guy. Shoulda Pilch down at the 33rd, same thing. And Corky Corcoran, now downrange, were a couple key players that helped us think through not only how we wanted to craft this, but the content of it. And as I talk to that, I think, again, it's important you understand, okay, why are you guys writing this? Because this is a little bit of a passion for me to make sure that we've had an opportunity to fly this incredible platform. Okay, how do we help others? And how do we help the F-35 community, and then really the greater partners and services that are now just jumping into the fifth gen operational environment. And so it was probably about the time I got into this job, I started looking for a concept of employment. Okay, so where's my Israeli buddies? They're back here. When they go, hey, what have you guys learned? What are the big rocks that we need to be thinking about? You know, you start looking around and didn't come up with too much. We had a lot of tactical information in 3-1, well written, very thoughtful, detailed tactics. And then you have the SAS, strategery, high level stuff. But when you start to look for the operational, you know, let's say you're the new CFAC or you're the new Joint Force Commander and you want to wrap your head around what are the key issues I should be concerned about when I get these fifth gen, I found us to be lacking there. So what I'd offer you today is this paper that we've put together is just the start. It's the tip of the iceberg. I would share with you that I'll have a chat with General Goldfein because there's more work that needs to be done with this. And in my discussions with General Robinson when she was at PACAF, she was in desperate need of something that could quantify the big rocks and something that was written down that she could hand to partners to help them understand, here's some things that we ought to be thinking about. So this is a first attempt at that. And I think we've got it tight enough that you can sit down in about 10 to 15 minutes and get a pretty good idea of where we're going, what we're thinking, and some of the things that we've learned. Clearly, lots more work to be done, and there's more details that need to fall behind this, but I think it's a good start. And the other part of it that I'd highlight as we get into questions, hey, I had to keep this thing unclassified so we could talk about this. Too many times we end up trying to talk about, quite frankly, capabilities that are in the classified regime. And really, we wanted to raise this up high enough so that we could share it and have this conversation and help others not only get educated, but inform them and demystify some of the things that you might read about in some local publications. So as we started to lay out the paper, some things that we thought first were very important was to scope this. So you'll find we focus largely on aircraft. Quite frankly, Raptor and F-35, okay? Recognizing there are clear linkages to space and cyber, and we have to get after that. But you all know if I was going to have to write about that, it would have been a 30-page paper and none of you would have read it. So we focused on the Raptor and the F-35 side of the house to scope it and get it down to something that, quite frankly, could begin this conversation. We also recognized that we didn't want to talk about the how, rather it was to talk about the what. What are the key issues that functional component commanders should be thinking about as they get these airplanes in their operational environment? So we start with first, generally just describing and defining what 5th Gen means in terms of some specific characteristics. And I'll talk to that here in a minute. And then I think it's important to understand some of the key enablers, primarily with respect to training, from both a pilot perspective, a maintenance perspective, and I'll also highlight some key security issues that continue to be a challenge for us that I think are critical to work through if we're going to be particularly requiring our partners to be in that lane next to us as we go out and fight. Okay? Then what we'll roll into is talking a little bit about the data dependencies and how important data is to these platforms. And then I'm going to have Freak talk about the deployment piece, the employment piece, and what we put in the paper is a vignette that takes place out about 10 years from now, 2026. And this is to walk through how we would envision operations occurring out in that time frame. And then as we close, I'm going to highlight a little bit about the importance of working through the codification of how we integrate these platforms into not only our Air Force, but the joint and coalition force. I think that's critically important that we continue to move that forward, particularly given the growth of F-35s here in the future. So let me start quickly talking about the characteristics as we thought through this. So certainly the low observable piece of it up front, from a multispectral perspective, not only just the structure, but the radar, some of the other inherent capabilities from an IR perspective, and even the situational awareness tools that the airplane brings to it. The next highlight that I think everybody's very familiar with is integrated avionics and sensors, and how those autonomously fuse and prioritize for the pilot to reduce his workload, allowing him to focus more on the mission as opposed to managing sensors. I'd offer to you that that increased SA that's provided to that aviator is really the first piece of man-machine teaming that the DepSecDef talks about right now. And if you look at how we have manned, particularly leveraging the helmet with the F-35 with the machine, you've got tremendous capability that is really our first step in providing that asymmetric advantage to the pilot with the situational awareness that it provides. I'd also highlight another key capability and characteristics of these 5th Gen platforms is your comm, nav, and identification capabilities. The ability to rapidly and in a redundant fashion have the capability to communicate and then leverage data links both internal to the formation and external to the formation are critical then to how we're going to share data across the fight. And I'll talk more about that here in a minute. Another important capability that I believe has to be baked into the platform is electronic attack and electronic protection. And I think you'll find, while in an unclassed format you can't get into a lot of the details, the capabilities that are embedded in this platform enable them to go to places that, quite frankly, our 4th gen legacy aircraft can't go. And again, that's a huge advantage that a 5th gen brings into it. Another area that a lot of people like to pick at, but I think is critically important, is the cybersecurity aspect of a 5th gen platform. I think we all understand the threat that cyber brings, but as you look at, quite frankly, how the airplane not only has been designed, but some of the inherent security apparatus that are inside the airplane, a 5th gen airplane have an innate ability to protect itself much different than some of our 4th gen and legacy aircraft. And I think that's important to remember, because as you get into the details of how the aircraft is actually operating, there is a very robust protection capability in the airplane from a cyber threat. Importantly then is another, particularly from a maintenance perspective, is the advanced diagnostics and understanding what's going on with the airplane. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but particularly with the F-35, the ability to have prognostic health maintenance and understand when parts are going to have to change out, particularly in a dynamic, austere environment, that will be fundamental to delivering the capability in particularly a PACOM environment. Ultimately, these characteristics, at least for me, define the important pieces of a 5th gen airplane and what they bring to the fight. I would offer to you that as a couple of guys that have had a couple assignments, particularly flying the Raptor, people often ask me, so what's probably the most important part of all those? Well, I know there's a couple of guys that flew Raptors here, but there's nothing like running an intercept and then at the end of the day realizing that nobody ever saw you. I mean, okay, we got Viper, we got Old Eagle guys in here. You nod your head, but until you did it, you don't know. It's that good. And that capability allows you to do things, combined with the next piece is going to be the integrated avionics. Our ability to focus on battle management and become a mission commander as a Raptor, and ultimately F-35 guys are going to be able to do the same thing, is unmatched. It allows you to better understand where you need to be in the next 3 to 5 minutes, where you need to move assets, to have that battle space situational awareness to make decisions quicker and better than we could in any other legacy airplane. And that is fundamental to the 5th gen platform and what it brings to the fight. And I think what we've seen, particularly with the feedback we've gotten from the Raptors downrange, is how that brings the level of the entire formation up. Everybody gets better. And that's because of the capability that and the things that are going on inside these 5th gen platforms. The other piece that we'll highlight just briefly, and this is more of a reminder of why I believe it's important that we have 5th gen in the fleet, which you would think would be obvious, but I think it's important to remind ourselves, is as we look at operations in these highly contested environments with modern long-range SAMs, increased air-to-air threats, and as you look at the capability these days that the threat has to move targets, make them mobile, the ability to find targets in a time-sensitive fashion, particularly in an area with modern integrated air defenses, the only folks that can get there are going to be 5th gen airplanes. And if those targets are moving, you're going to have a significant challenge with any other legacy type platform to make that happen. In fact, what I'd offer to you is, and General Wells said this all the time, but if you put a 4th gen jet in there, they're going to die. Now, we can debate that. I think at the end of the day, he's exactly right. But in our minds, what this comes down is the ability to kill and survive. All right? You can go in there, And you may be able to get your bomb off, but your odds of living through that are not going to be high given the threat environment you're operating in. And at the end of the day, as I think about that, and if I were put into that situation as a CFAC, that better be a pretty darn important mission. That mission risk level better be off the charts if I'm going to send your kids downrange to go do that. And I think it's important we don't forget that. And so as our fleet, particularly the 4th Gen fleet, gets older, that challenge is only going to increase. And as the threat continues to evolve, as it goes digital, we have got to have this airplane to go in deep, gather that information, find those targets, and then deliver the effects that the not only the air component needs, but the Joint Force Commander needs to execute his mission. So we highlight that briefly, and I think it's important to remember that going forward. The next piece of the paper that we talked about really focuses about the training required from a 5th Gen aircraft perspective. And training will be no surprise to anybody sitting out here. Everybody goes, yeah, I got it. People, we got to train the people. But I think there are some things that are important to highlight that, quite frankly, we have to think through the culture change as an Air Force. As you have these platforms, you've read about our challenges with being able to replicate the highly contested environment that we might need to take these platforms into. I think we all understand if you're going to have those types of threats, whether they be air-to-air or surface-to-air, it's quite frankly going to cost us too much. Can't afford it, can't get the complexity we want, nor the density we want in those types of environments. So we're going to have to invest, and we are, in live virtual constructive training. And when you ask yourself, okay, what does that mean? Well, here's the way I think about it. Everybody knows what live is. Virtual is going to be the individuals in a sim. Okay, they're in the simulator, linking those guys together. And then you got the digital targets, the constructive guys. So my first question always is, and I'm going to talk to you guys here in front because you're going to go figure out how to do this, is how do you get a constructive target into the cockpit? And then what happens to that constructive target at 15 miles? And don't tell me, oh, Cobra, we're just going to blow them up in your visor. Yeah, I can't afford that. Okay, so we need your help to think through how we do that. The next piece is concurrency. If I'm going to put a guy in a sim, it better be just like the jet. Okay? And we've got to make it a realistic environment that forces them to come out of that simulator sweating. If it's not, our young guys will never buy it. I wouldn't buy it. I'd go, what do I want to go do that for? So we got to get that right to the point where they go, yeah, I want to go to the sim. And it's going to provide me the type of training I need. Clearly, we've got to find the right balance between the live piece and this virtual constructive piece that I'm talking about. And we've got to prove it to our young aviators that that's the right way to go. Because until we prove it to them, they're not going to want to go there. I guarantee your son won't want to go. So that's what we got to get after, and we got to figure that out. The other part that I think we need to think through is, particularly when guys are in sim, is, and I'll talk to the actual full mission simulators, is how do you replicate that risk involved, whether it be terrain, G-loss of consciousness, the standard admin things of weather, and making sure that's as realistic as possible, so that as you then throw these high-density threats, complex threats at the highest level, that they've had to work not only through the administrative part of getting out there, but also the fight. So there's plenty of work being done on that, but I believe we got plenty to do. And we're going to need industry's help, and quite frankly, as an Air Force, we've got to make sure our young aviators buy into it, they believe it, and then we've got to work through the culture required to make that happen. On the other side, we've got our maintainers. And I'm sorry I keep hitting this thing, or I'm blowing into it. But on the maintenance side, again, there's a significant training piece with respect to understanding how to manage the low observable part of the airplane. And I think over time, we've made sure, particularly on the Raptor side of the house, that that's been embedded in the maintenance side of the house. And we've raised a group of maintainers that understand that. We're now in the process of doing that on the F-35 side. And they have got to be together with the operators, understanding the impacts of what low observable and where the jet is with respect to that does to the ability to employ the airplane. The other piece that I think is important is working through, again, that machine-to-machine learning from the jet, and I'll just use the F-35, into Alice, and making sure that that data sharing is pure, such that when it kicks out what's going on with the airplane, immediately the maintainer knows diagnostically what's wrong, and then, as I talked about, working through the prognostic health maintenance piece of it, such that, and Freak will talk to this a little bit in the scenario, if we are having to launch and land at another location, we have great understanding of how the airplane is operating and what are those parts that we ought to change now before we send it on these types of missions. And as simple as that may sound, let there be no doubt it's hard. And I'd love to have this debate with maintainers, because everybody goes, oh, how hard can that be? It's not easy. And it's going to take some time, and we got to mature the airplane and gather the data and then be thoughtful about how we apply what we learn to the maintenance practices. Finally, a point that, and this will get into my next point here, which has to do with security, and that is we have to be thoughtful, particularly with partners that are going to have F-35s, is how do we leverage them? Do we do exchanges? What do we do to ensure that if we land at a base that has F-35s but it doesn't have U.S. Air Force on the tail, that they can help us turn a jet? We got to figure that out, and that's on us. Those are policies and issues we have. I got it. It's a security problem. It's a challenge, but it's something I've encouraged our A4 community to think through, and I know they're taking a look at that. And that leads then to the security challenge associated with a fifth-gen airplane. And I won't get on my soapbox, but I'm pretty hard over on this and that. We have got to figure out how you train like you're going to fight. And I can't talk about a lot of the issues other than people need to understand the airplane needs to, when we go out and fly, it needs to be like we're going into combat. And there's a balancing act there between how much we share and how much we protect, but we have to work our way through that. So, my position is if there's a brand new guy going out to fly, a lieutenant comes out of pilot training and he goes to Eglin or Luke, he better be learning the numbers right from the get-go. And that's a problem. We got to work through that, and that's something that I've taken on. We've made some progress, but there's plenty of work to do. Another key area that I'll talk about here in a minute is the data that supports the airplane, and how we can leverage what partners are doing. How do we ensure that if we're going to fly out there together, that when I see a guy that's read, my Brit over there in the other lane is also seeing a guy that's red, and we're sharing the same info. There's challenges associated with that. There's policy challenges that we've got to work through. And I think it's important that and we highlight that, and it's one that hopefully we get a little more attention to going forward, because as the threat evolves, as our TTPs, our tactics, training, and procedures evolve, we need to be able to talk to that, because if you were to look at some of the plans that we could be executing in the future, we're going to be relying on those guys to help us. And I sure would like them to have a common understanding of what we're doing and what we expect them to do. Which then leads to the a paragraph we talk about fifth gen's dependency on data. Okay, data is a cool word. What am I talking about? All right, everything from the threat, friendlies, the terrain, weapons, all those have data that help inform us, particularly from a lethality and a survivability perspective. There are impacts, clearly you can imagine, as you look at where that data is going. As we feed that data against, in a F-22, it's the threat data set. F-35, it's mission data files. It's that library of threats that help inform us on everything from how we're performing against that threat to when we want to shoot weapons. And then, as I alluded to earlier, it informs us when we share data across the formation or out of the formation. That helps us have a common operational picture. You'll see in the paper that I highlight what I believe will be critically important going forward is how we get data off this airplane. or these airplanes? And it's something that we've struggled with. I will tell you, General Carlisle put his finger in my chest and said, Cobra, we got to figure this out. So the question becomes, okay, what data, how much, to whom, and how much latency can you afford? Big questions. So frankly, what we need to work through, and we're working through that, is you can imagine the PowerPoint slide that would show data going to different nodes and what that data is and how latent we can afford it to be. And that's something we've got to figure out, and we need to understand what that concept would be so that we can then work through the widgets that would make that happen. And we got to get after that. Once we understand that, and I think now General Grinkowicz and his Air Superiority 2030 ECCT team did a fantastic job about talking about data to decision. Because you'll see in the paper we talk about F-22s, F-35s getting deep, and they're the only ones who can go there. And we got to get the data off those airplanes into some cloud-based architecture that then shares it with the force. We have to figure that out. And we've talked about some ideas. I know there's some good ideas out there, but you'll see us highlight that in the paper as a key capability going forward that we need to work through, because the data is inherent to the airplane. It's there. We have to figure out how to move it. And then at the end of the day, you have to have people that understand this architecture and how you build it, and then are able to manage it. And that's, I'm not going to be able to do that. There's going to be some young 22-year-old, 23-year-old that'll figure that out in a minute. And we have to grow that expertise and allow them to be key partners in this, this fifth-gen generation that we're growing. So with that, I will now hand it over to Freak, who will pick it up from here on the deployment piece. Over to you.
Great, sir. Thanks. I hope that everybody can hear me and see me all right, and thanks for letting me partake in this. The one area of the paper that I wanted to address is the deployment, sustainment, and employment of fifth-gen systems. As far as deployment, the fifth-gen units are very similar to fourth-gen units, but in today's anti-access aerial denial environment, the A2AD, I think we need to make some improvements in how we pick up water and get out the door. We really need to look at improving our deployment reaction time and speed so that we take advantage of big targets and or take advantage of windows of availability, or potentially an IADS is completely built up or is moved to deny access to an area. Along with that, I think not only commanders at the squadron level, but all the way up the chain need to have a very good understanding of the logistics, sustainment, and communication limitations at the deployed location. What I've seen is we develop this fifth generation force, there's going to be a huge reliance on all that data that Harrigian was talking about, getting back to the mothership to figure out what parts do I need, and we've migrated to this just-in-time maintenance and sustainment architecture, that we have to have a real good understanding of how are we going to get those parts downrange, especially as we start moving towards more of a flexible basing or adaptive basing concept of employment for some of the O plans that we're going to do. We also need to figure out what is our partners' capability to support those operations. If we aren't at a U.S. field, we're at some type of coalition or partner nation field. For the fifth gen, we also need to not only understand but practice operating from some of these austere type of locations where we may find ourselves. And to give a quick little story, I was able to go to a bilateral airman-to-airman conference with the Royal Australian Air Force, and we took a trip up to one of their forward staging bases that is in the northern part of the Cape York Peninsula, and it's called RAF Base Burger. The geography of it may not be very relevant to fights in that theater, but what it was basically a runway, taxiways, and some buildings on a patch on a 10,000-foot runway, and there were 3 or 4 guys that just maintain that, mowing the grass and just making sure that the base is functioning. But it's a great opportunity for either Air Force or even Marine Corps F-35Bs to deploy in there with the minimum amount of stuff and people and see how well they can operate in that environment. We also, in that deployment phase and sustainment phase, need to ensure that all of the systems, whether it be age equipment or the computers that plug into the jets or any of the backstop type of repair equipment, need to be hardened and resilient to not only kinetic attacks, but as General Harrigian alluded to, cyber attacks, cybersecurity. So we have to make sure that those things are wrapped in protective layers and we don't expose ourselves. As far as employment and employing successfully, we obviously will have to be able to address our threats across the entire spectrum. So on one side, we've got a relatively permissive or an easy environment to fight in, which I'll take the liberty to say that the things that are going on in the CENTCOM AOR are a competitive air environment, at least from the air domain, all the way to something that's highly contested that you could imagine could be somewhere, especially in the PACOM AOR. So in those permissive or moderately contested environments, you can force package 4th and 5th gen aircraft, and in that situation, the 5th gen would be a lot more supplemental to the 4th gen for detecting targets, targeting 4th gen aircraft, and I say in quotes, using their weapons, depending upon what configuration that 5th gen aircraft is in, they may not have as many air-to-air weapons as 4th gen guys. And that also requires a very robust data sharing capability, and that's something that both General Harrigian and myself have seen a lot of, as that's how we do a lot of that force packaging in our training between 4th and 5th gen integration. Now, as the environment starts becoming more contested, you may have to, the Joint Force Commander will start making decisions about packaging primarily 4th gen assets up front and keeping those 4th gen or legacy assets more in the rear echelon so that you can use the 5th gen to create pockets of permissive airspace to allow the 4th gen assets then destroy their priority targets. This goes back to that concept of knocking down the door, get in, it's going to be a localized air superiority, but still execute the mission and then potentially have to withdraw from that. While all that's going on, to amplify the discussion that General Harrigian had on data, the ISR enterprise, which these 5th gen aircraft are going to be part of, need to be able to report all that mission data back, not only to the the F-35s or the F-22s, we've got to get that to our legacy fleet. We've got to get that also back to our partner nations, because I don't think that it's wise to expect that there's not going to be any changes to any of the parametric data that we assign to threats once we kick the war off. So radar is going to look different, SAM radar is going to look different, target tracking radars might start looking a little bit different, and we're going to be able to collect this data, but we need to quickly and rapidly assess it and disseminate it out to the 4th and 5th gen community. And now that, I want to put on this because I think that that's probably going to be one of the hardest things that we're going to have to figure out, because there are a lot of policy constraints for that, but we have got to get past that, and we've got to figure it out now on how to share this information in that changing combat environment, and we've got to figure out the processes to do that. It has to be quick, and it's got to be something that we've thought through, and we've got to get there's a lot of legwork that we'll need to do, and we can do some of that through conferences and crosstalks. But one of the things that the paper also mentions is that you also need to make sure you get your 5th gen folks on the staffs to help educate our leaders and talk through these tough policy issues. And I'm sure everyone is aware of our fighter pilot manning shortages and how we prioritize putting them out on in the squadrons. But there has to be some concession some of those guys on the staff that are smart on these issues and can work the balance of the protection of information versus the ability to use that information to increase your combat capability. Now, from the transitioning to the maintenance side of the house, there are some additional considerations, and General Harrigian, I think, has hit on most of those, but the low observable management and the logistic enterprise, and how do you support your deployed forces? Can you leverage their service capabilities and some of their sustainment packages and or partner nation coalition, and how does this change during the phases of a conflict? And I'll get to some of that in the vignette. But if we're relying on UPS and FedEx to, haul parts around the world for us, what happens when UPS and FedEx can't get there? How do we link up the civilian side of logistical distribution to the military side to make sure that we can get the things that we need? So with that, what I'd like to do is go into a summary of the vignette that is in the paper, and it is taking place in 2026. And at that point in time, I'm sure that a lot of you have seen the composition of the fighter force with these people have a mixture of legacy aircraft. And in this vignette, the U.S. is needing to respond to rising tensions in a key region, and bonus-based aircraft are mobilized, and they're getting ready to deploy. And as they're getting ready to deploy, there's already a wave of adversary-sponsored cyber attacks that immediately start attacking some of the unclassified computer systems that support that fifth-generation aircraft of deployment. But because we've spent a lot of time thinking through redundancies in these systems, for example, something like Alice, those attacks are thwarted by a combination of our cyber defense and our backup capabilities. Now, why those bonus-based fifth-generation aircraft have deployed and they're gearing up for their combat missions, they are able to, as they enter the theater, deploy and disperse to multiple locations so that we don't have a concentration of our force at one spot, no more than, say, a squadron or so at a base, so that we have the force dispersed and we make it difficult for the adversary to have a targeting, or give them a targeting problem to try and hit our aircraft with any type or combination of theater ballistic missiles and or cruise missiles. So what that does is it prevents them from having that capability and make a knockout blow to us. And it also helps deplete the inventory of some of their TBMs. Now, some of those airfields may or may not have navigation or air traffic control facilities, but since we've thought about this and we've trained to it, in the 2026 timeframe, your F-35 and F-22 pilots are proficient at finding their landing area by using onboard sensors, whether it's radar mapping or whatever other sensors they may have, and they're able to basically fly their own approaches and inclement weather situations back to these airfields with the minimum of ATC type of support, which then decreases your sustainment or your deployment packages, but increases your ability to flex to different bases. Now, as these combat operations ramp up and continue their intensity, the fifth-gen aircraft, along with F-35s from coalition countries, are effectively integrating and collaborating in the open phase of the operation, thanks in part to a lot of prior consideration and exercising of security, maintenance, logistics, and command and control plans. There aren't any surprises concerning the multi-level security construct of the operation, as the U.S. military has built very transparent relationship with its key allies and partners in the preceding years for this exact sort of contingency. Now, during the opening days, the fighting is focusing on the battle for air superiority, and aircraft from both sides are clashing over this contested territory. Heavy radar and comm jamming confront a lot of the U.S. coalition forces, but fifth-gen aircraft leverage their networked multispectral sensors to detect and target these enemy aircraft while supporting a common operating picture through data links. The legacy aircraft are operating in the rear echelons, but they provide a very important layered defense in depth for ongoing ops. Occasionally, F-35s will return to bases to discover that that base has been hit by either a theater ballistic or cruise missile, and they are unable to land at that airfield until the airfield is repaired. So the pilots, because they've been thinking about this and training about it, have a tiered list of bases they can land at, and they know where they need to land based off of the health status of the aircraft and the repair capability of a field, and they make that decision to land the aircraft. And we have well thought out procedures to move pilots and swap pilots out and get those aircraft back into the fight and get them turned. In one example that I lay out, the U.S. Air Force F-35 is forced to land in an Australian F-35 base, and has a maintenance problem, and it is not able to necessarily get to U.S. base, but because we've thought through all this, the Aussie maintainers are able to repair this aircraft and get it back into the fight in minimum time, and then it is able to recover back to a U.S. field. Now, as this is going, fight is going, some civilian aircraft have been damaged during the airfield attacks, and that has halted commercial logistics operation. But in response to the situation, the commercial and military distribution channels have been able to ensure that adequate supplies, spare parts, weapons, and fuel can get to these first airfields. And as the operations continue, it becomes apparent that stealth aircraft like the F-22, F-35, B-2, and B-21 are the only aircraft capable of operating in contested territory due to the large number of surface air missiles and the advanced targeting and the longer range capability of those AMs to target aircraft. So the fifth generation aircraft are the ones that end with the majority of the airfields. The F-35s in this situation use their advanced geolocation capabilities combined with stealth and their stealth signature and EW tools neutralize a lot of these things, allowing the joint force operations to steadily increase in their freedom of action. And despite a lot of the heavy and non-kinetic attacks on the Combined Air Operations Center, on the KAOC, the Joint Force Air Component Commander is able to provide command control, or C2, to both legacy and fifth generation units, even though the KAOC will find itself momentarily offline, because we have spent time, effort, and energy into ensuring that we have redundant communication systems requiring as little bandwidth as possible. And another example, our fifth gen aircraft are able to take off, and using their advanced sensors and our long-range communications capability, they can take off with a minimum of information. They just know that they're going to a refueling track, and eventually they get past information for refueling and rendezvous frequency, and subsequently start getting targeting information passed to them as they're airborne, because some of the targets they're hitting are 1,000 or so miles away. So they have plenty of time to receive that information, and then they're able to prosecute their attack and eliminate those targets. And one more on the vignette, there is a ballistic missile attack on one of the Air Force bases, U.S. Air Force bases. And unfortunately, there's the large number of Austin maintenance personnel that are killed. But our allies and partner nations are able to help provide maintenance personnel, ops personnel, that can help turn airplanes and repair airplanes so that we can maintain the ops tempo of the conflict until U.S. reinforcements are able to arrive. Now, as the conflict continues, fifth-gen aircraft continue to seek out and destroy advanced SAMs in the contested territory. And that eventually enables the legacy aircraft to operate alongside their fifth-gen counterparts as we take this contested environment and turn it into a moderately contested or permissive environment, the point in time in which U.S. and coalition forces are successful. So that was my wrap-up of the vignette. But what I would now like to do is make a couple of closing comments before I pass this back over to General Harrigian. And I hope that in the 42 or so minutes that we've been talking, that you've learned a little bit about 5th Gen. And what I want to pass on to echo what Jim Harrigian said is we learned a whole lot about 5th Gen operations in the F-22. And we have both been in it for about 15 years or so. And our attempt in this paper is to pay forward a lot of those lessons learned so that we don't repeat the mistakes or the rabbit holes that we went down in the F-22. I think it's also important for everyone to realize that aircraft have growing pains. Both Cobra and myself have many examples of the growing pains we went through in the F-22. But we have to remember that those aircraft will eventually mature, and we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater too soon, because what I've seen is our innovative airmen will figure it out. And some of our biggest hurdles to overcome that I've seen in my 15 years of working with 15 airplanes are in the policies that surround the aircraft, not necessarily the performance of the aircraft. And with that, I'll pass it back over to General Harrigian.
Okay, thanks, Freak. Only thing we kind of close with in the paper is a recognition that 5th Gen is just one tool in the toolkit for the Joint Force Commander. And as we look forward, integrating this capability, like I said earlier, not only into the Air Force, but with our joint team and with the coalition fight, so that the Joint Force Commander has other options, is fundamental to what this capability brings. And I think as we look towards that integration of 5th to 4th, 5th to 5th, 5th with our Marine and Navy partners, we've got some issues to work through there. And this is, like I said, our first attempt to talk about it. If we have an air component commander that's never had an opportunity to work with these platforms, it's a starting point. There's clearly more work to be done, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity for those that follow, as Freak said, us, to further refine this, develop it, and have something out there for our folks. Finally, before we go to questions, I want to thank General Deptula, Abby, Mark, the Institute for all your help with this. You guys have been fantastic. We greatly appreciate it. And with that, we'll open it up for questions. Freak, you can't leave yet, so stay awake. Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
Hi, General. Laura Seligman with Aviation Week. You talked a lot about data and the importance of being able to share data, not only with the legacy platforms, but also with our international partners. So what is the thinking about how the best way is to do that, especially when some of our partners have cybersecurity concerns? And I know General Bogdan has said that they're working with some of the partners to build cyber defenses on either side, so nothing important, no sovereign information can get through. So how do you balance this? How do you deal with this issue?
That's a great question. So the first place I start with is we got to make sure we get the data links right, and at the tactical level, even at the operational level, we build an architecture that ensures, as Colonel Marosko talked about, if we got a 4-ship of jets in one lane and our partners have one in the other lane, we need to see the same picture. And so ensuring that architecture is still built properly, so that we're on the same frequency, if you will. And then the second layer beneath that is really, if we're talking F-35s, has to do with the identification of specific targets. In other words, ensuring that as my airplane looks at one target and says, hey, this is what this is, they're seeing the same thing. And there's, quite frankly, we got to go out and fly and do it. There's some policy issues that we're talking about that we have to work through to ensure that our libraries are the same. Because if our libraries are different, then you could have some issues there. And what I'm talking about in F-35, of course, is mission data files. That's the library I'm referencing. And so we're working through that. And we're going to have opportunities to do it. What we're reinforcing here is let's make sure everybody understands the problem now, and we elevate it to the right people so we can get after it. So that we can go exercise and train together before the balloon goes up and we're now trying to figure it out in combat. Okay. Yes, sir.
Sir Alan Thompson, retired Air Force, currently with SPA. You talked about policy a little bit, and we can look at our heritage going back to 1947 and even Desert Storm with their F-15s. They did such a great job. But obviously ROE is going to play a role. You're going to see that more in the job you're about to go to, and congratulations for that. So can you talk just very generally with this distinguished and experienced audience about some of your ideas on ROE when it comes to 5th Gen, particularly F-35, F-22?
So I think one of the, and Freak, you can be prepared to tag on to this. One of the areas, and this is why I want to have this conversation, is we need to educate people on what the airplane actually can do. F-35 has the ability to build in an ROE. It's actually in the off-board mission system part of the jet. So you have to understand what that is informing the pilot, and that's going to be based on clearly theater ROE that'll have been worked up the channel. But what I'm advocating here is we need to educate folks on what that means, so that as it comes up the chain and then the CFAC has to talk to the Joint Force Commander, everybody understands how that data has been promulgated to the pilot and then is laid out in his system or her system for an understanding of whether they can hit the button or not. And that's critical to, and I'll share with you, I understood how it worked in Raptor. It's at another level in F-35. And we have some work to do to not only train ourselves on what that's telling the pilot, but then to train the next echelon or 2 echelons above us. So there's plenty of work to be done there. Quite frankly, where I'm trying to start is baseline of making sure as the young pilots build what I'll just say turns a guy red, we understand how that works. Because quite frankly, the engineers will design it one way and it doesn't always work that way. And so we got to go out and fly it and make sure that it's telling the truth. And as we build that trust, that will now enable us to inform commanders on, okay, here's why we have this ROE. Is that, Freak, you got anything to add to that?
Yes, sir. So I think that the first question and the second question are pretty closely linked as well, because the ability to ID appropriately is really going to be tied in to how coherent the data sharing is to have. So given an example of, Brit F-35s in one lane, US F-35s in another lane, if our databases aren't synchronized, then you're going to end up with conflicting identification issues, which could delay employment and put our the force, at more risk, which we definitely don't want. So we have to understand that the policies that restrict information flowing between nations, sometimes we need to make sure we separate the data versus the source of the data, so that we can ensure that we're all on the same playing field and we don't have any ID problems that could lead to, most likely, a lack of shooting, which would end up putting the pilots at more risk. So that's an important thing to consider. And educating the commanders and the lawyers that we grew up with aircraft that the pilot would actuate things to get through an ROE matrix. The pilot sometimes now doesn't actuate anything because the jet does it. And the jet may not look for a certain identification feature because it knows that that aircraft doesn't have that feature. It knows it's a bad guy aircraft. And so that's one of the things I know that we went through in incorporating the F-22 into CENTCOM, because of the differences of how the F-22 runs through its ID process as compared to how the pilot in the F-15 would run through that ID matrix.
Yeah, so this isn't simple. And you need to understand the details of it and then be able to communicate it up. And while we're talking kind of air to air, this is also air to ground, particularly the tremendous capability F-35 brings with that we need to understand. Yes, sir.
Chuck and Carl, Max, this is for you. Having read every page of Chinese unrestricted warfare, they're not going to give you a break. They're going to, your vulnerability isn't data, it's gas. They're going to take out your tanker bases. You don't have conformal tanks. I don't think you can carry drop tanks and maintain stealth. If they take away your tankers, what are you going to do?
Well, I can't get into too much detail on how we're going to solve for that because we're working on O plans, but what I would say is we're looking at a manner of what the Air Force is calling adaptive basing. And that adaptive basing is a realization that you can't always live underneath the umbrella of the EVM or cruise missile threat. So you've got to be able to position your force in an area of relative safety, and then at your choosing, be able to position your force to an area of advantage when you are ready to commit your attack operations. That's about probably all I can. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we're going to try to preserve that to the Air Force.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Tony Capaccio with Bloomberg News. You did a good job of laying out the importance of the data mission files.
Mm-hmm.
Over the last 2 years, Dr. Gilmore's office, DOT&E, has raised that major red flag about that. Can you walk us through the progress made or not made since the report came out? And on IOC, are you closer to an August 1st date than a December 1st date, or can you give a sense of that?
Come on. It's going to be in the window. It'll be, you know, I think what I first highlight on IOC is the deployment we had to Mountain Home went better than anyone could have imagined. 88 for 88 sorties. They never lost a sortie. I think they were 15 for 16 with bombs, and the one bomb that missed was because of a bomb problem. The naysayers of, you know, Alice is going to be a significant challenge, non-issue. The transfer from home base to the deployable Alice hardware. And Tony, what I tell you, when you give this stuff to airmen, get out of their way. They got it. And that's what we saw in this deployment. So clearly General Carlisle's going to take input from his operational test community that's working through the IOC readiness assessment. They're going to take feedback from Colonel Lyon in this his team's deployment. And I think later this month he'll get together with the new chief. They'll have a discussion. And I'm feeling very positive about it. You know, I think there's a lot of confidence right now, not only in the airplane, but in our airmen to deliver that mission.
Mission data file?
Yeah, and so on mission data files. So here, okay. There are those that, you know, as you look at a mission data file, there's an awful lot of data on it. And particularly for an F-35, it can absorb all that. And one would argue, well, you pretty much need to know the world. It's unobtainium, can't do it. We've laid out these areas, these regions where we're going to build these files, and we're going to know as much as we can. My position, Tony, has been we are going to have unknowns. So I'm more worried about having a process in place as soon as we see something in the field that is an unknown, that you can then turn it back into the system, and 2 days later, you have a new MDF. So we've done 2 tests of that, kind of baby steps. Because quite frankly, our lab at Eglin, which I know you're very familiar with, they've been working incredibly hard, doing a fantastic job. And so they now have the basis to be able to do that, but we have more work to be done. But we're very close on all 4 of the AORs we were looking for IOC. In fact, there were 2 required, and those look good. I think at the end of the day, though, I'll come back to you can't know everything with a mission data file. It's impossible. And so we're going to do the best we can in the labs. We're going to go fly them, which I think is what Dr. Gilmore wants to ensure we've done. And then I want to be sure that when Hill goes someplace and they see something new, we have a process in place that reacts to that and gets the mission data file changed. It's the same thing we went through with F-22. So that's my position on that. Yes, ma'am.
inside the Air Force. I had a question on training and also a question on 4th to 5th connectivity. On training, you mentioned a few areas where there need to be just more, maybe more kind of progress. LVC was one, and I know you mentioned improving the capability of the simulators. Can you give us a more, I don't know, a little bit more insight into the status of the of what's happening there, and then also like, do you need to see more investment in order to get the progress that you're describing? And then I'd ask a similar question for the 4th to 5th connectivity.
Okay.
What's the challenge there? What's the issue with kind of getting that online?
Okay, so I'll start with the simulators and try to keep this relatively high and not dive into the weeds. But the key first, all right, I got to go back and say, okay, live is flying in the airplane. The virtual guy is in a simulator. And then when we say see, that's a constructive target. So a constructive target is somebody on the ground pumping a fake target, a computer-generated target, either into the simulator or into the airplane. Does that make sense? That's hard. So let's say a guy's flying in an airplane, and we put, I'm sorry, I got to use my hands. You got 2 blue guys, 2 red guys, and you go 2v2 with an F-35 or an F-22, yawner. Get nothing out of it. Okay? So you really want this to be 6 red guys. So what do? You pump 4 constructive targets that are guys running around out there that are in these guys' jets. That's hard. And that's what we're trying to figure out how to do. Because can you imagine, okay, you got to look back up again because I'm going to use my hands again. So these guys take, and I'm talking air to air, these guys take some shots. So they shoot 3 of them, and then some guys maneuver, and now let's say you have a constructive guy here at 15 miles or so. Well, typically what we do is we look outside. So how do you now make that look right to the guy in the live airplane? That's hard. And so that's what we're working through right now. AFRL is working with industry to develop that. We're looking next couple of years to, and General Carlisle is all over this, and he's pushing it. I can't give you a direct timeline off the top of my head. I'd want to make sure we got the facts right. But that's what we're trying to figure out. Because until we get that right and understand how that's going to work, guys, our young aviators, they want to go fly. But to get that complex, high density, highly contested environment we need, we can't afford to do this and go 2v6. We just don't have the airplanes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Do you need more investment in order to kind of meet the timelines that you have right now?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is understand how much of that do we need. What's the right number of simulators versus flying live in the airplane? We've done some work on that. More work to be done because, again, I'll go back to it. At the end of the day, if we're sending young guys to the simulator and they're not getting good training out of it, they're not going to want to do it, and I don't blame them. So we got to get that right. What was the other question?
I'd asked a similar question about 4th to 5th.
Yeah, so 4th to 5th, right now we're using Link 16. And that's what we're going to use for a while. There's some advanced capabilities they're working on. We can get into the discussion about Link 16 in a highly contested environment. Probably not the right environment to do that, but what I would tell you is we're looking at TTPs and ways to manage Link 16 in that environment to maximize what that brings to sharing information between 5th and 4th. And I'll leave it at that.
Hey, sir, can I piggyback on the track?
Well, if General Deptula will let you.
Yeah, go ahead, freak.
Okay. Just the last thing to think about in that LVC conversation is also making sure that we have an adequate range complex. And we're doing that right now with an enterprise range review. And we may not be able to afford all of the threat systems, but if we can have a good constructive threat system, whether it's air-based or surface-based, you can create that dense IADs that you have to fight your way through, but you can also do it in a live environment where you have you have the terrain to worry about, weather and the leans and all those other things you get when you're fighting, or the things that you experience when you're flying at night, G's, all that. So we're doing that, and the J Park Range up in Alaska, where Red Flag Alaska takes place, is really on the leading edge, at least in my opinion, on a lot of the LB incorporation that they actually do in Red Flag Alaska right now. Over.
Thanks, Freak.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Cobra and Freak, for taking the time to give us that tour de force and start looking at concepts that the technologies of 5th Gen enable. If I could be so bold, I would suggest to you that the underlying theme is the ubiquitous and seamless sharing of information, which quite frankly is the basis for the third offset strategy. So with that, we have a token of our appreciation for you. I know you're going to have plenty of time as you fly out to the AOR, but you know, in your spare moments, you want to kind of clear the mind. It's a copy of a book by John Olson, Air Power Reborn. So thanks very much for being here. And Freak, I got your copy too, but I'm waiting for approval of the TDY funds to be able to fly out there to deliver it to you. So ladies and gentlemen, please help me thanking our speakers. Our next Mitchell Institute forum will have Lieutenant General Dog Davis, a Commandant of U.S. Marine Corps Aviation, who is a fan of 5th Gen employment and gets it, which ties together the joint piece, and he'll be here on the 29th of July at 9 o'clock. So look forward to seeing you all in. Thanks very much.